A little bit of music while we let everyone roll in. Is an independent bookstore. Welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few moments. Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here to discuss Until Justice Be Done by Professor Kate Masur with our guest, Professor Daryl Scott. We are so excited to have you joining us today. Let me first start by telling you a little bit about who we have joining us today. Firstly, if you're brand new here, we are Lost City Books, a used, new, and rare bookstore owned by our owner, Adam, located in Adams Morgan, no relation. We are run by a close-knit team of some of DC's coolest kids, including myself, artists, educators, musicians, writers, and of course, avid readers, all coming together to create this unique environment and curate our eclectic selection of books. I'm your host for this evening. My name is Shady Rose. I'm very pleased to be here. About our author, Kate Masur is a professor of history at Northwestern University. A finalist for the Lincoln Prize, she is the author of An Example for All the Land, Emancipation, and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C., and of course, more recently, Until Justice Be Done. Daryl Michael Scott is a professor of United States history at Howard University, where he has taught since 2003. From 2005 until 2009, he served as chair of the department. He started his career at Columbia University in New York City in 1993. In between, he served as director of African American Studies at the University of Florida in Gainesville. So you've been all over the place.
Yeah, kind of, sort of.
About Until Justice Be Done. Until Justice Be Done, America's first civil rights movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, is a groundbreaking history of the movement for equal rights that courageously battled racist laws and institutions, Northern and Southern, in the decades before the Civil War. The half century before the Civil War was beset with conflict over equality as well as freedom. Beginning in 1803, many free states enacted laws that discouraged free African Americans from settling within their boundaries and restricted their rights to testify in court, move freely from place to place, work, vote, and even attend public school. But over time, African American activists and their white allies, often facing mob violence, courageously built a movement to fight these racist laws. And there's a lot more to know about this book, so I'm going to just close my screen and let you all jump right in. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for featuring Until Justice Be Done.
Wonderful. Well, if I may begin, if that's
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, for years, I've been a student of free Blacks. And in the literature, people have always said that if you want to understand what would happen after slavery, you had to understand the status of free Blacks in antebellum America. And that's kind of an old way of thinking about, I should say, long-standing way of thinking about the free Black population in the North, their struggles and their travails and so forth. And so we kind of know that. And we also know the North is different from the South. And historians have talked about that. We know free Blacks in the South were under one set of conditions, living with slavery. And then as emancipation comes in the North, then we get free Blacks there who are struggling for rights. So we know they're struggling for rights. And then a new generation of scholars comes along, and then they talk about the great Black protest tradition in the North. And so there's a lot of focus on that. And so then we know all the stories of the Negro Convention movement that pops up in the 1830s, where Black folks come together and they protest for their rights. We know that the abolitionists are recruited into this movement for people to get their rights. But what we never talk about, in a very interesting way, we never step back and say, this was a civil rights movement. Okay, that this was a movement in the North in which a lot of people, not just free Blacks, not just the abolitionists, is something, but also politicians and also other institutions. So there's a lot of people involved in this movement, and it's not just an East Coast movement. It's a movement that takes place throughout the North, and it's a movement. Now, that was the most striking claim to me, that this was a coherent movement in some kind of way. So I found that a very fascinating project to just say, I want to look at this as a movement. And I want to ask you, the first question is, how did it come to your mind to think about this as a movement?
Well, thanks so much. And also thanks for that kind of the background that you provided. So I think, first of all, it's so lucky for me to have such an informed, historian who's been looking at these things for a long time. So I think one of the things that I wanted to do is, bring to light things that might be familiar to some people who have immersed themselves in history all their lives, in the study of history, but bring it forward in a way that where some aspects of this story certainly would be familiar, but to kind of cast this history in a new light, and in the process unearth some new things. So I would say, first of all, as you said, I mean, this is a book that's about, as the title suggests, it's the first civil rights movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. And what I'm looking at is the free states. And I think, to begin, one of the most consequential things that happens at the beginning of the United States as a nation is one set of states decides to go down the road of abolishing slavery. And another set of states, some of them have a discussion about whether they're going to abolish slavery, but then they basically do not. And in fact, they double down on it and they expand slavery, right? And so you have many people don't know that when the American Revolution got started, slavery was legal and practiced everywhere in British North America, right? So you have a conscious decision on the part of some states. And that's another thing that's important about this story is it happens at the state level. Some states decide they're going to abolish slavery. Other states double down on slavery, and you have the beginning of this sectional divide that becomes, the central kind of divide that in the end leads to the Civil War in certain ways. So what I'm talking about, and sort of one of the ideas that is behind this book, or like the premises of it, is the antebellum North, the pre-Civil War North, was in some ways a post-slavery society. And when you really think about it, they're going through and kind of talking about all of the same issues that we know to be the issues that come up during Reconstruction. And I have in the past written a lot about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so as a historian of that period, I was sort of like, okay, all of these people come into power as Republicans in the 1860s, when Lincoln gets elected, let's say in 1860, they have political experience grappling with on the state and local level many of the same exact questions that they're now going to be confronted with on the national level, right? And so my question in a way was, what did that struggle look like? What kinds of experiences had people gone through in the North? Who was involved in these debates about essentially racial equality or the parameters of equality after emancipation in the North? And I started to see this movement kind of everywhere I looked, but it took different shapes in different places. And so one of the things I write about is in the Midwest, these states, starting with Ohio in 1803, they come into the Union as states. Slavery has been, at least in theory, abolished in these states by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, although slavery is still kind of practiced in some areas. But in theory, these are going to be free territories. And yet they come into the Union as states with these anti-Black laws, right? So they pass laws, starting with Ohio, and then other states proceed to do the same thing, Illinois, Indiana in particular, later Iowa, then Oregon and California. They pass laws that require free Black people to register with local officials if they want to live in the state, post bonds for good behavior to show that they won't become economically dependent, don't permit them to testify in court cases involving whites, exclude children from public schools, and don't allow Black men to vote. And so what you have exemplified in those policies at the state level is really the idea that the United States in every jurisdiction or in the country as a whole you could abolish slavery and still have a racist caste system. You could have an apartheid type system, right? And so, from a legal perspective, that is not what the United States ended up with, although in many ways we still obviously are grappling with these same kind of questions. But how did we get to a point where it was unacceptable to have laws like those state Black laws that literally discriminated based on race? on the very surface, right? That literally said Black people do not have the same rights as white people. So one part of this movement is the struggle to get those Black laws repealed. They're called Black laws, to get at the state level. And I can talk more about why these laws were constitutional, because I also think it's really important to understand that this was not, nobody at the federal level was going to tell the states that they couldn't do that. Right. So that's a really important point, that it was entirely constitutional under the US Constitution to have those laws. And then the other part of this kind of civil rights struggle, the struggle for racial equality, has to do with Eastern US states that did not have those type of super racially discriminatory laws, although they had some, but not in that same level. And the activists in the movement in those areas were not looking at the same problems facing their state governments, but they got really galvanized around the rights of free Black sailors. And it's really interesting. It might seem like weird and idiosyncratic to focus on sailors, but if you think about it, first of all, there were a lot of free Black sailors sailing out of New York City and Boston in particular, to some extent Philadelphia. Being on a sailing ship and working the merchant kind of commercial channels from northern cities to southern cities was a pretty good job for a Black man in that era, in terms of wages, in terms of autonomy that you would get to have on the job. And so there were a lot of Black sailors going out of these northern ports. And yet southern states passed laws that require, because white Southerners were very worried about Black sailors coming into their ports. They were worried that they were going to spread ideas about revolution, that they were going to foment slave uprisings. And they were worried about not just free Black sailors from the US North, but also from the Caribbean, from the British Empire, from Haiti. And so they passed laws that were directly, these southern states, that directly targeted Black sailors and required them, for example, to spend their time in port in prison, in the local jail, and then they could only get out when the captain of the ship came and paid their jail fees and allowed them to go out. And so the shape that this first civil rights movement takes in these northeastern states has more to do with them making the argument that these southern states are violating the rights of these free Black sailors. And they're looking at interstate issues, and they're trying to figure out a way to get the federal government involved, particularly because it is an issue that crosses state lines. If you think forward to the freedom rides of the 1960s and the strategy of using crossing state lines to create a civil rights issue that automatically goes to a federal issue, there's something similar going on here. And so what I'm saying overall is that this civil rights movement, or racial movement for racial equality and civil rights, takes different forms in different places, but everywhere we see it, we see certain qualities, and those have to do with Black leadership, the white allies. I mean, truly white people also involved in this movement. The problem that Black people face everywhere in the North, or one of the problems, is that they're in a small minority in terms of population. And then in many places, Black men are not permitted to vote. And so if you think about, and this is one of the things that really interested me while I was working on the book, like, how do you change policy, right? How do you actually get a better policy if you don't like the policy? And then that question becomes, kind of really difficult to imagine if the people who want the change the most are a very tiny minority of the population, and or actually don't even have the right to vote, right? So like, some of the book actually is about strategies for making what is a marginal political position, pushing it toward the center of politics, and trying to get enough people to agree with this position that they're going to actually make change.
It's a fascinating moment, right? And you're right, the Black population in the North is small. Okay, roughly 200,000 by the time we get to the Civil War. But for the most part, for the longest period of time, we're talking about tens of thousands of people across a vast expanse. We're talking about a time frame of 7 decades. And so we're talking about this long period, lots of space, lots of time for things to happen with a small group of people who are trying to make it happen. And one of the most fascinating things is they do make it happen, right? They have this idea that you've got to connect slavery, anti-slavery, with the fight for their rights too. Okay, so it's not just about freeing the slaves. And this is, we typically think about that's their role, trying to free the slaves. And they, of course, that is part of their role. But they're also insisting that today, now, we want our rights, and beyond rights, and this is a very important part of what you're doing, you're introducing the question of citizenship, right? And so what would differ your book from a book from 40 years ago would have been everybody was talking about civil rights and equality. Your book is framed at a certain moment where citizenship is understood to be a very important part of all of this, right? And there have been several books, as you know, and you cite all these books where citizenship becomes the issue. And so you get this federal government that doesn't have a defined notion of citizenship, or should we say it's just amorphous and it's nothing certain. And then you have these state governments, by the way, I believe they have a better sense of citizenship than even you do. And they have a sense of what a citizen is and who a citizen is and what it takes to be a citizen. And they don't see everybody as citizens, okay? And so now these Black folks are trying to fight for rights as citizens. And so Martha Jones talks about this in Baltimore. Chris Bonner talks about this in Massachusetts. And so it's not Chris in Massachusetts. It's actually Stephen Kanovitz who talks about it in Massachusetts. So we got a lot of people who are talking about this move towards citizenship in a federalist system, right? Where the states have a lot of power, and most of us can't understand that. We live post-New Deal. The federal government is everything. The states are relatively nothing, okay? But once again, we start seeing it does matter. We're starting to see state rights matter. But we don't know about the 19th century where citizenship is really local. It really is the state government. And so you negotiate all of this and you show how they convinced a lot of people to join their cause, right? And then in particular, they do this in the Northwest Territories, right? What becomes the states out of the Northwest Territory, which is completely marginalized in a discussion of abolition and rights. I mean, we have some studies about Cincinnati by my colleague, Nikki Taylor, but we don't have any kind of integrated way of thinking about the whole. And you put the Midwest, as we call it now, into that equation, and you make a good case that much of this happens because of what takes place in the Midwest.
I mean, look, one of the things that's interesting, there's a lot of, kind of disconnects in the kind of history that we know. And one of the things we know that I think will be familiar to a lot of people is some of the most prominent men of the Republican Party of that era are from the Midwest, right? So we have Abraham Lincoln, we have Salmon Chase from Ohio. We have, a variety of different people who come, Lyman Trumbull, who's one of the authors of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which I really care about and write about. And we know from political history that for the Republicans to take national power, for Abraham Lincoln and his party to get into power, they needed the Midwest, and they were very strong in the Midwest, right? And so we know that part of the story. And yet on the side of the story that's kind of about the abolitionist movement, we're so often stuck in Boston, New York City, and we're not looking at these places. And, and then there's this kind of stereotype too in the literature, as you know, that the white Midwest was irredeemably racist, right? So like, you also wouldn't expect to find anything progressive looking in the Midwest because we know they're all a bunch of yahoos anyway, and the real white radicals are out east. And so, one of the things that's really interesting to look at, and the major success that this movement gets in terms of repealing Black laws is in Ohio, where the state legislature repeals most of the Black laws in 1849. There are a lot of white people who are willing to go along with repeal of those laws in Ohio. Illinois is a different story, right? And I write about Illinois, where it was a much harder road, although they do end up repealing them in 1865. But I think you're right. We need to know more about the kind of, first of all, Black communities in the Midwest and Black migration from the slave states into those Midwestern states, which is a really interesting story. And then also the politics of those places and the ways that some of the white leaders who we may be familiar with actually had connections to this first civil rights movement that people really haven't unearthed very well.
You do a job explaining something that I have started calling the the visibility of equality. Okay, if you look into the debates between the abolitionists and the fire burn eaters in the South, you'll start seeing them talk about equality, and they agree. They agree that it's an all or none proposition. So the abolitionists would say, you give people their civil rights, their whole set of rights, their citizens, and so forth. And so you can't divide equality, right? From the social, the economic, and the political. You can't divide. And the slaveholders said, oh yeah, we agree, you can't divide it. And so a free Black person is not a citizen. To be a citizen is to be equal. It's out of the Midwest. It's not completely out of the Midwest, because you have the separation of civil rights, voting rights, social equality, where they divide equality, right? They say it's divisible. Okay, and that's one of the things that you show. I mean, you don't use that language, but you really show how they go to work on particular issues, right? And the economic sphere, and in the political sphere, and in the sphere of civil rights and basic rights. And you show how they don't have to take the whole parcel or none. They start talking about parts of this thing or the other part. And so they seem to work something out. But yet at the same time, it means that there's a consensus, but it's not a consensus anybody who wants equality would feel completely comfortable with, right? This is, you kind of gloss over that in the telling of the big story, but it doesn't seem like many people would be happy with that half bucket of equality, right?
I mean, you're right. And so, but I think, we can also, first of all, let's just be clear that we live in a society that's like that, where like we have certain professed commitments to equality. Some we try hard to meet, or, in terms of like, I don't even know which ones. I mean, some basic civil rights or rights to due process. I mean, some basic rights to vote, but we don't try very hard to make some of those promises real. And we don't even make promises about equality in a lot of different areas. So thus has it ever been, in my view. And so the 19th century people had a very kind of regular language they use. They would talk about civil rights, political rights, social rights, or social equality. But you're absolutely right. I think, so first of all, I wanted to always be clear in this book that the goal that the activists that I'm writing about primarily were looking for was some form of racial equality. So most of these people, but not all of them, were not arguing for women's right to vote. They were not arguing that vagrants or people who were identified as vagrants or paupers should even have due process rights. Like they had one preeminent goal, and that was to get rid of racial barriers. They were not, as I sort of thought of this recently, like they were not very intersectional. A few of them were, but generally speaking, they had like their eye on one goal. But then within that, you're also right that, so I think, and I think it's very true that the Black activists, most of them who I write about, had the most expansive vision of racial equality. I mean, it stands to reason, right? Because they're like, look, these racial distinctions people are making are really stupid. They're nonsense. And so like we're not that interested in parsing equality. We want all of the rights, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes, and you've probably seen this too, sometimes when they get to like, people would say, are you arguing that, for interracial marriage? And they might say, oh, no, never mind. We're not interested in that.
Well, but that's the interesting thing, because one of the things I think you have to explain to people for them to really get the importance of your book is that this is not the second civil rights movement. Okay. These are completely distinct civil rights movements in a sense of the objectives are different. Okay. No one's looking for fair housing. Right. No one, by the way, some people believe in mixed schools, as they would call it. They would literally say mixed schools, but you would not say by and large, people are looking for mixed schools as this is where the center of the Black community was, the white community.
They wanted schools, period. They wanted access to public schools. Right.
That's right. So the question is, will there be schools? Will there be public schools? Will they be that our kids can go to? And can we have housing? Can we buy housing? right? Do we have access to banks and to courts and things of this nature? Can we testify? And so some of these are very basic rights that they're looking for in this civil rights movement. And they're not, and they don't have a strong central state that's behind them until, right? Until, and then for what that consensus is. Now, I think you do a kind of a wonderful job showing folks, right, where that consensus is and proving where it is. In fact, I was really struck by what you did in the chapter that deals with when the Republicans come to Washington. Okay, and your first book really, I must help you a lot in writing this book, because you understood the lay of the land in Washington, D.C., some of those issues, a lot of those players. And so you know the importance of that new regime coming to Washington, D.C. in 1860. And you lay out, and you should lay out for everybody, just what the Republican Party, largely coming out of the Midwest, does when it gets to Washington about these issues with rights. Before Reconstruction, they start doing a lot of things. And explain some of that to people.
Yeah, I mean, and that I sometimes, this is bad history in a way, but like sometimes trace the origins of this book to the exact question or point that you just alluded to. So to give the history part, the Republicans, they sweep into a majority in Congress and the presidency in 1860. They take office in 1861. And then a bunch of Southern states secede from the Union. So their power is expanded, right? Because the Southerners are out of the country. They're not participating in lawmaking. And so they really have the Republicans now in Congress and the presidency really have the capacity to implement an agenda with very little standing in their way. And they actually have even more of that with respect to the District of Columbia, because they have unadulterated power to make laws for the federal district, because the Constitution gives them that, unlike the states, right? And what do? Not surprisingly, they abolish slavery in the district, although it is also interesting that they do it through compensated emancipation. They do it by actually paying enslavers to some extent, the value of the people who are becoming free. But yes, they begin the process of abolishing slavery. But then not only do they do that, they also repeal the racist laws of the district that would have. So like, you have a situation where you're abolishing slavery. If they had kept these additional laws on the books, then all the free Black people would have had these kind of special laws that applied to them, right? They couldn't assemble at certain times of day. They had to have licenses. They couldn't get a license for certain kinds of businesses. So the Republicans not only abolish slavery, but also repeal those racist laws to create a regime of racial equality before the law. And also, by the way, they create a public school system for Black children for the first time. There hadn't been one in DC until then. They repeal any laws related to testimony. So they make racial equality in testimony. And then later they're going to, although this is getting ahead of the story, but they're going to implement Black men's right to vote in Washington even before they do it in the Southern states. But let's just go to they actually sort of abolish slavery and repeal the Black laws in 1862, right? And so one of the arguments that people make for the origins of Reconstruction policy, especially the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is the first federal civil rights legislation, and the 14th Amendment, is this is the conventional narrative is the Republicans, the Civil War ends in the spring of 1865. The Republicans look at what's going on in the Southern states. The war is over, and basically under President Andrew Johnson's power as president, these states start making new governments, and they immediately start passing what are called Black laws, which are Black codes, these racially discriminatory laws that are designed to basically, kind of make free Black people a completely subordinate class, almost to the level of slavery, without actually saying that it's slavery. And so the story goes, Congress takes a look at that and says, whoa, we've got to do something. And then Congress convenes in December of 1865, and then they sort of hammer out the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. But sort of if you say, well, yeah, but Congress actually did a lot of that type of stuff in 1862 on the District of Columbia.
Exactly. And this is that's what makes your whole project so persuasive. Again, the first book helps so much with the second book, is that you really understand that stuff and how, no, this is not an 1865 story. No, this is about the Republicans coming to power. And look, I, just like anyone else who was doing this kind of work, would have said just what you said about us, which is to say that we talk about 1865 and the black codes, and then horror of all horror. And so the moderates get pushed to the left some. And I have trouble in Wade and all these people is not being very progressive. The progressives are Thaddeus Stevens and the progressives of Sumner, right? These other folks aren't all that progressive, but none of this could have happened without them. This is something that you demonstrate that they had gone through this in the Northwest. I mean, and they knew what black codes were. They had their own version. And they said, no, we're not doing that. That's not what we're doing here. Now, but that leads me to the next question. Was the Republican Party more progressive in general than Abraham Lincoln when it got to Washington, D.C.? But we reduce this to Lincoln studies, quite often, as you know. Lincoln gets assassinated, and then the next thing you know, we discover there's a Congress, right? I mean, in other words, we know this, but we discover that they're not gonna lead Reconstruction, so forth and so on. But it looks like they're leading when it comes to DC, the Republican Party as a whole, not just Lincoln, and they seem to be more progressive than Lincoln.
I think it's hard to say. And I worked hard on how I represented Lincoln. In the book, I write about Lincoln in Illinois in the 1850s, and then I write about Lincoln as president in the 1860s. But more specifically, we have a hard time, I think, because Lincoln's very political, okay? And Lincoln wants to get elected. So it's very hard. And I think people who want to make excuses for Lincoln or sort of put him on the right side will say, well, he said a bunch of kind of racist things, but he didn't really mean it. He was only saying it to get elected. And I'm not really in that camp, except possibly a little because, so for example, okay, in Illinois in the late 1850s, they're debating whether to repeal the black laws, or at the very least, there's a lot of black activists and a fair number of progressive white activists who want to repeal the Illinois black laws in the late 1850s. Evidently, and we don't have a lot of direct evidence, but kind of indirect evidence, an African-American activist named H. Ford Douglass at one point presented both Lincoln and Trumbull, who was a US Senator, with a petition, signed this petition asking the state legislature to repeal the black laws. And apparently both Lincoln and Trumbull said no, thank you. Now, you could say, well, because they didn't actually want to repeal the black laws, or you could say they didn't want to be associated with that because they wanted to get reelected and they thought that if they did that, they would, stand to lose reelection, right? And we don't really know the answer, but I think what the evidence is that as president, Lincoln never vetoed any of that stuff that Congress was doing. He signed all of that legislation. Lincoln's attorney general in 1862 is asked to issue a statement on the question of whether free African Americans are citizens of the United States. Mm-hmm. And in December 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's attorney general says, yes, I'm 100% certain as attorney general, I'm saying black Americans who are free are citizens of the United States. And that's quite interesting because also the attorney general, Edward Bates, was from Missouri. He was not at all an ideological radical. And he was kind of like already there. And Lincoln, so there's a lot of things going on during Lincoln's presidency that Lincoln is either tacitly or explicitly approving of. That's like, yeah, this is the kind of country we're trying to create. So, it's everyone's both representing a kind of political ideology and also looking out for what is going to keep them in power or get them into power and what's not. And I think, that's one of the interesting things about writing about politics. We see that today. I mean, it's one of the interesting things about thinking about our own politics today, right? What do people feel comfortable saying publicly when they're in politics, and what do they think privately but don't necessarily say?
Okay. I have a question here from one of our viewers that's related to what you're getting into. Daisy asks, what motivated those Midwest progressives to push for repealing the black laws, and what sort of arguments were in circulation?
Yeah, I love that question. So I think, and I think it's hard to know, but this probably sounds really idealistic, but first of all, the arguments that people were making were racial discrimination is wrong. And it is not fair for people to be singled out by race and be subjected to certain kinds of laws and policies because of their race or color or however they wanted to describe it. And for authorities on this position, they would cite the Bible, and passages. Of course, the Bible was often cited in defense of slavery, right? So the Bible can be cited for a lot of different things, but they would cite passages of the Bible that emphasized kind of universal brotherhood of mankind, the idea of treating people as you yourself would want to be treated, the idea that all nations of man are created of one blood. So they would cite the Bible. They would cite the Declaration of Independence, and the proclamation that all men are created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they would also cite what they would consider to be sort of natural law, or the idea that nature, God, kind of science, the world made us all equal. So they would bring these texts to bear in their argument. Of course, as I said, there were a lot of other authoritative texts that could be brought to bear on the other side. But they would make these arguments and they would say that these laws are wrong. And I think part of their strategy in the movement was to draw attention to them. So if you had white people who were just like, oh, that doesn't concern me, right? Like, well, whatever our state laws are, it just doesn't concern me. They would, in their newspapers, for example, they would publish stories of the abuses that happened under these laws, right? So the newspapers would tell stories of like a Black man who was the victim of an assault, but by a white man. And the only witnesses to the assault were other Black people. And so nobody could help a prosecution in court by testifying because of these Black laws. And so they would say, like, look, how can this be? This is so unfair. So they would kind of tell stories that illuminated these abuses. And they also associated these laws with the slave states. So sometimes, especially as the sectional conflict got more heated, they would say, the reason why we have these laws is because our lawmakers are trying to appease slave owners. And this was especially effective in like Ohio and Illinois, these states that actually border on slave states. So right across the Ohio River from Ohio, you have Virginia and Kentucky. And so they would say, these are about our cowardly lawmakers who refuse to stand up to the slave power, to these slaveholders. We have to assert that Ohio is not like that. We are a different kind of state. We value all people. So in one way or another, I mean, they make these arguments, but who was persuaded also probably had to do with who was already likely to be persuaded, right? And so I think white people with particular kinds of pre-existing political orientations would be more likely to be persuaded, like if they were generally in the Whig Party, if they were generally kind of reformers who also favored certain other kinds of reform movements, they were more likely to say, yeah, you're right. Like, I never really thought about that before. And then you had these kind of on the other side to be really, sort of stereotypical about it, were the Democrats who Northern Democrats increasingly made it the position of their party that they were like extraordinary white supremacists, right? So that their position was developed in opposition to that, to the point where you would have Stephen Douglas of Illinois in 1857 saying, this is a white man's country. The Declaration of Independence was never intended to apply to anybody besides white people. So these differences really get played out in party politics.
Here's you almost seem to be giving everyone the abolitionist argument, okay, which is the equality of man, right? Okay, we believe in it. We think that we don't believe in racism. We don't believe in inferior, superior races. We don't believe in that. And that the white supremacists do, and we don't. I spent a lot of time in my life trying to argue that these are separate things. And that you could be for equality under the law and still believe in the inequality of man. The equality of citizens, the inequality of individuals, the inequality of races. Now, because a lot of that rhetoric that comes out of the Midwest, Vogel and I talked about this years ago. These people were raving racist in many ways, and so then if by the way, which means you end up with a Republican Party that can be racist and for equality under the law against racist laws, but racists themselves.
Yeah.
And so this to me seems to be what's happening in the Midwest. And then there is this fusion, of course, virtually, but what I guess I'm trying to say is that the races are North and South, everybody, including the abolitionists are the most progressive. That's the best way to put this, right? And they start talking about it, but we all know we can go back into their writings and we could tease out what we would consider to be racism. So everybody's a racist to varying degrees, but not everybody is saying so. They still are citizens, and therefore they should have these rights. And that's the fascinating part. I think that is how they come to some kind of consensus. We don't have to say you're equal inherently to have equality under the law.
I mean, I completely agree. And I hope, but all right, just one quick thing, like some of those earlier studies that were just like, oh, the white North was just unredeemably racist. Yeah. They tended to cherry pick their quotes from Democrats. Right. So like many times they would
quotes they had too.
Okay,
I believe
but so what interested me was, and also I felt like a lot of studies of white abolitionists did this. It would be like trying to get into their hearts. Right. So it'd sort of be like, well, in his personal writings, he would be like really patronizing about Black people or really, kind of couldn't deal with the idea of like having dinner with the Black person. But I was not that interested in what people did privately. I wanted to know what they did in public policy.
And that's exactly what you're saying. And that's how they were dealing with it. They're saying, we don't care if this person is intellectually inferior. We don't care. He's still a citizen, much like everybody else, and they still do these rights. That is the success and the limits, right, of the first civil rights movement. Okay, and one might very well argue that kind of ends up being what happens the next time around. But there is no great effort to change the hearts and minds of men around of that basic question of, do you believe in science and do you believe in hierarchies, right? No one really tried to. I mean, the abolitionists would do this sometimes, right? And Black writers would do this a lot. Okay, the Black abolitionists would do it a lot. But a lot of the political types outside of Stevens and Sumner, when you go to the other places, that people are not doing this. I mean, but I am still struck with how they have a consensus on equality under the law.
Well, because you didn't have to be a perfectly, anti-racist person to support the policies that we're talking about. And like, because I cared about policy, like because I cared about political change in this book, that's what I wanted to focus on. Is so they got a lot of people in the coalition who, like those people, if they sat down and talked to each other, they would not have agreed on a lot, especially to do with issues of race. But if they're all willing to vote for, support a party that supports racial equality before the law, okay, fine, right? Okay.
But this takes, I guess part of what I guess I'm saying is this. We take our modern sensibilities back there and we try to measure things by that, okay? And by the way, your use of anti-Black and racist laws shows that Kendian influence on somehow on how you structure your argument, right? In other words, how you not structure your argument, but the vocabulary that you're using in making your argument. So yours is the first book in which I started seeing racist laws.
Although, well, that's interesting.
So yes, from some of the first time I see it, but
those laws were literally racist, right? I mean, I'm talking about laws that were literally.
I'm just saying that you explicitly call them racist laws.
Yeah.
And the tradition is, we would always say that they were discriminatory laws. We would talk about racism. It's not like, I'm just saying that the adjective racist laws is that kind of as a phrase.
Yeah.
And then but it does talk about the modern sensibility. And one of the things is about the limits of that modern sensibility. Because if we go looking for the anti-racist, and this is maybe an easy way to put it, to make people understand today, you're against racist laws, but you're not an anti-racist. Okay, see, and that is that distinction. And the people who are looking for anti-racism out of these Republicans, they're not going to find it outside of a few people. but yet they're going to find substantive change. And you're going to find people, and this gets to the other issue, you're going to find a coalition of white people and Black people, okay, who are going to bring about change, even though the Black people know the white people got a bunch of problems, okay, that there are limits to these white people. They're not anti-racist, okay? And so, but they're not so much concerned about whether they're purely anti-racist. They want outcomes, right? They want citizenship. They need citizenship so that they won't be shipped abroad, right? They need citizenship so that they can travel the country and do business. They need citizenship so that whether this guy thinks that he's superior to me or not, I need to get to Charleston so I can work, right? And I can go back and forth. So the limits of your allies is something that they live with, right? So anti-racism was not the agenda. Anti-racist laws, as you're pointing out, that was the real agenda, right?
Yes. And yes. Yes.
But then you got a strange coalition. Today we don't think like this.
Well, it is interesting. There's coalition building going on here. There's outcomes that are like good, but not great, right? Like people are not getting what they would want in an ideal world, but it's better than what they had before. So it's complicated. It's like how politics works.
But I tell you now, who you begin to sound like? You begin to sound like old McPherson talking about these same issues. And I'm waiting to see whether you get any pushback on that front. In other words, there's been a tendency to talk about, and McPherson calls it self-liberation, right? Where you don't have a coalition, it's just simply the movement, whether it is Black people striking for freedom and emancipation, right? And so then that's how we end slavery. Didn't have to have a war, so to speak. Didn't have to have Union soldiers. So yeah, I'm saying there's that part, but now today we see this once again where people are starting to think that the movement happens, it's all Black movement. And so allies are not that important. Allies get to the rear. But you're talking about a movement where everybody's involved and it's not quite so clear. And this is one of the things, and I know we got to end it, is how much interaction are there between these Republicans and their Black allies? I've been wondering about that in your book and in general. Just how did they know each other, particularly in the Midwest?
I would be happy to talk about that, but do we want to go to the question that came in, Shady?
Yes, I think it's actually kind of related anyway to what you just said, Daryl. But we had a question from Patrick saying, reconstructions after abolitions have their ends. How does the momentum die? How do we get from Northern liberation to Dred Scott or Southern to Plessy?
Okay, that question reminds me of what Daryl was saying earlier about this first civil rights movement is not the same as the civil rights movement. And I would argue, right, that actually one of the reasons the second civil rights movement, or the thing we know today as the civil rights movement, partly its agenda was shaped by the actual successes of the civil rights movement, right? So the book ends with the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And these things actually do deliver the goals of this first civil rights movement, however limited and constrained they may have been, including making it illegal to overtly discriminate based on race in these kind of state laws, right? So all of these state laws have now become unenforceable. Granted, right, federal enforcement, as we go into the 1870s, 1880s, and so on, these laws were not adequately enforced, but we do see, for example, we've been hearing a lot now lately about like the ways that when Southern states start disfranchisement by law by the 1890s, they know they can't use racial terminology in disfranchisement. Why not? Because of the victories of the first civil rights movement, basically, right? Like they all have to find their workarounds to do this because the first civil rights movement in its culmination in Reconstruction basically has taken certain kinds of racist policies off the table, even though for sure that leaves plenty of room for other kinds of racist policies that then become the things that the next civil rights movement is going to have to take on. And, that is, I would say that's like how I sort of understand the history. I think, that's both pessimistic thing to say and an optimistic thing to say. It's like, it's like something changed. On the other hand, did, the first civil rights movement deliver on all of the things it could have? No. Could they have predicted what would happen next once they got a lot of the things they wanted? No, probably not, right? Because we're all living in our historical moment, fighting the battles that are in front of us, not able to see what the next thing is down the road. So I think, there's something to the argument that these kind of rise and falls of moments where it's possible to make changes in the direction of racial justice, of grappling with these issues and coming to some kinds of positive outcomes often are indeed followed by reactionary periods, but that we're not always fighting the exact same battles, right? That in the process, the conditions under which these struggles are waged change over time. And it's helpful as a historian. Of course, we say this all the time, right? It's not history repeating itself. It's different versions of similar struggles that all go back to, in my view, the way that I like to say it, they all go back to the reality of racial slavery in this country, right? They all go back to how do you grapple with the legacies of race-based slavery? And these are the kind of ensuing kinds of struggles that we are stuck with, unfortunately, and they are kind of defining, right? And so I think we have to kind of live and make decisions around that. I'll just say really quick on, so how much, I want to kind of circle back to your question. There's instances where these Black participants in the movement and the white people obviously are coming together. There's an example where in Cincinnati, a Black church, I think it's a Baptist church, decides to thank Salmon Chase for his work defending fugitive slaves. They invite him to a ceremony and they give him like a vase or a cane or something like that. And they praise him for what he's done. And he talks about how the next step is going to be voting rights for Black men. Actually, I think this is in like 1845. Mm-hmm. There's examples in the Chicago story, plenty of examples of people in this movement who are Black and white interacting with one another. Black and white Chicagoans get together to forcibly resist the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 and later. So there's like examples of, or another example is when the Black lobbyists come to Washington in 1866, right? And it's people from this movement in the North who come to DC to lobby the federal government, both Congress, the administrative agencies, and the president for good federal policies. Right. They're meeting with people that they've known for a long time. And I mean, some of them, right? So there's some of that, but I wouldn't want to overemphasize it either, right? In many cases, they're also kind of organizing separately in like Black organizations and white organizations.
Now, Ken, I want to say that this movement was a lot more successful than you're letting on. I mean, look, the civil rights laws stuck in the North.
Yes.
Voting stuck. The right to testify stuck. The right to own property, blah, blah, blah. So there is a North and a South. Now, today we kind of say there's a North and a South, and it doesn't make a difference. Anything south of Canada is the South. No, there was a North. And there was a North because of the first civil rights movement. And if there was no success in the first civil rights movement, there would not have been the Black votes in the North to have the second civil rights movement. So, claim the whole thing. The people who want to erase the North and the South, they need to forget about this. You're showing that there's a North. We haven't talked much about the South because this is not a Southern story. This is a Northern story that got imposed on the South. It didn't stick there, but it's stuck in the North. It wasn't perfect, lots of issues. The North was chock full of racism, but the first civil rights movement worked in the North.
Thank you. Yes, I totally agree. There's other examples, right? From
the hard argument, because I know you're right on that.
The movement, right, continues at the state level, just in the North. They passed public accommodations laws after the Civil War, right? They go on to demand desegregation. Exactly. Of public accommodations. Black men continue to vote. They hold office. And so that kind of retrenchment that we see in the South does not happen in the North.
In the North. The people want to
pretend. Even though, as you say, right, the North is chock full of racism.
Chock full of racism and white nationalists live over here and there and everything else. but that is just not the South, and we know. But that's an argument for another day. It's a great book, though. I enjoyed reading it, and I think your newborn baby, I hope will have great success.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you both so much for an incredible conversation. We've got a lot of appreciative comments coming in the chat here. It's been really wonderful to listen to you two just go back and forth with such energy about this subject, and I learned so much. So thank you so much. We're gonna go ahead and close out, but in the meantime, I would like to let our viewers know that you can buy Until Justice Be Done at Lost City Books. We're on 18th Street in Adams Morgan, and this book can be yours. You can delve into some of these incredible, detailed historical moments on your own, and perhaps come back to this video to understand better some of the insights that were shared today. In the meantime, if our viewers would like to follow you, say on social media, or follow your academia, Kate, where could we find you?
Well, I tweet sometimes at Kate Masur, KateMasur. Yeah, that's my Twitter handle. And you can always find my faculty webpage at Northwestern University. And if you're interested in hearing more, send me an email at kmasur@northwestern.edu. And thank you so much, Shady. And Daryl, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. I totally was hoping that you would say yes to doing this, so I really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed this. This is the summer highlight.
Awesome.
Absolutely. You've both been a delight, and thank you so much again for joining us. Viewers, we'll see you next time. Tune into our YouTube channel for future talks with authors, and come on into our store on 18th Street. We'll see you